The Advanced Material Editor has lots of different types of ecosystem layering options, and we're going to go ahead and take a look at some of those right now. So I'm just going to add in just a flat plane so that we can really see the effects of our ecosystem without any of the geometry interfering with our result. I'm just going to go ahead and scale this up. And just deselect our plane. We just want to make sure that it's set correctly. Reselect our plane, and now I'm going to open up our Advanced Material Editor. And actually, one thing I want to do is just start out, and we'll just add that grass material back onto there. And this way we're working with more of a normal material and not just the default, something with some extra layers in it. And I'm going to click OK for right now, just so that our scene can refresh. And then I'll double click and open the material editor back up. Now the first thing I want to do is go to click on EcoSystem so that we can add our first ecosystem layer. And I'm going to go ahead and add two different types of plants. I'm going to add our plum tree. And I'm also going to add our maple tree. And I'm going to reduce the scale of our maple tree down to 0.7, just so that our plum tree and our maple tree are a little more uniform in their size. And if you notice, right now we have a very, very large scale, so I'm going to go ahead and reduce our overall scale so that we have some much smaller objects. And then we'll also go to density, and we're going to increase our density. And what I also want to do is just go ahead and reduce those maple trees a little bit more, maybe down to 0.5, and click populate. Now what we're going to be looking at now is the distribution, which can be controlled with both a function and these two different settings that we have down here, affinity with layer and repulsion from layer. And these are currently grayed out because we don't have any other materials or any other ecosystem layers to blend these two. Now in order to really show the effect of this, because these are based on the negative spaces and the positive spaces of each of these different layers, and this is how they affect each other. So what we want to do is create a variable density, and I'm going to edit a function, just so we have some areas in there that have no population. Increase our gain and our roughness, and click OK. And now I'm going to click populate. And we can't really see the overall effect of this very much. So what I want to do is reduce our function scale to 0.5 and the overall, and hit populate once again. And I'm also going to increase our density and reduce our scaling just a tiny bit more. And in this case, we might even have to bring that back up. And now we can see we have some more negative space. I'm also going to use the filter just to reduce that amount a little bit more. And now we have some more open areas. Now when we want to add a new layer, we're just going to go ahead and click Add Layer. And if your chooser comes up to select a material, the best thing to select is just the default material, because that way it won't really interfere too much with what we already have. And then we can immediately change this from a simple material to an ecosystem. And that will effectively change our layer. And then if we have to, we can take our previous layer and go ahead and delete that. So now we have our two ecosystem layers. Our original that we created with the plum tree and the rural maple tree, and then our second. which is currently blank. And I'm going to go ahead and add a plant to this. And in this case, I'm just going to select our patch of grass and click OK. And now that we can see in the distribution that our grayed out features are now active. And they're currently set to 0, which means they are not being affected by the previous layer, and they are working independently. So if I go ahead and populate our patch of grass, we're going to notice that it populates all throughout our material and has nothing to do with the previous layer. I also want to just go ahead and scale this down so we're working with more of a normal scale. And we can see all these different patches of grass everywhere. And now let's make some changes to the affinity and the repulsion. And let's go ahead and just start with these individually. I'm going to increase our affinity and click populate. And what we can see happen is the more we increase the affinity with layer, our objects will become more drawn to the previous layer. So in other words, our grass right now is more attracted to our maple trees and our plum trees because they are on the previous layer. And the more we increase that amount, the more we're going to notice that our objects become more attracted to those other layers. So we can see all of these blank spots opening up again and reflecting the function that we had because our previous layer is controlled by that function. So I can increase that a little bit more. And we can see those areas enlarge, our blank areas. And it's a very neat way to have certain objects surrounding other objects. Like if we wanted to have maybe long grass around the bases of our trees, we could increase this value to 100 and have that longer grass just attracted to those different trees. And now repulsion works the other way. Instead of being more attracted to the trees, we end up having more of a decay near foreign objects type effect, where the grass is going to be created in our blank areas rather than in the more foresty areas that we have here. So I'm going to change our first value back to 0, and we are going to turn up our repulsion from layer and click populate. And now we notice that we just have this small patch of grass in what is currently the largest open area. And because this value is a little high, what's going to happen is we need to have a larger spacing between our trees in order for this object to be created. So if I reduce this amount, we should notice that more grass is showing up in the other blank areas. And now we can see this spread out a little, and we also have more patches of grass showing up in some of our other areas. We can also do the opposite of this effect and go into the negative values. I'm going to go ahead and click populate. And once we reach the negative values, we end up seeing the same sort of effect as we do with affinity, except that sometimes we do achieve different results. So I'm going to go ahead and reduce this repulsion down to 0 and go into a negative value with infinity. And we're going to click populate. So we almost see the same sort of an effect now that we had with the repulsion, where it's showing up in these certain areas. But in a way, it's still sort of attracted to our trees because we're using the infinity and not the repulsion. So it's a way to get more objects sort of within those in-between areas. And we can also use the two together to create some very interesting looking effects. And if we decide we want to add additional layers, they will of course reflect upon the previous layer. So if I want to add a new layer, I'm going to select that default, change that to an ecosystem, go back and delete that default, and now we have 3 different ecosystem layers, and we could add a new plant. And I'll just add our fern. And you can see we also have these distribution settings available for this layer. And these will basically reflect all of the previous layers because these other layers are also affected by their previous layers. Although, technically, it's just the bottom layer or the layer just underneath it. So if we wanted to create some of these, what we could do is we can increase the infinity, and that way these are going to be more attracted to those patches of grass. I'm going to reduce our scale down to 0.1 and also our overall scale and just click populate. And now considering the more than likely overlarge size, we didn't really see anything in there. So I'm going to click populate again. And we can start to see some of those new plants pop up in there around our patches of grass. There are also some other very cool effects we can achieve by using ecosystems on different layers. And I'm just going to go ahead and basically clear out our scene. I'm just going to delete our plane that we have. And I'm going to add in a standard terrain. And now I want to go ahead and we'll just add that grass texture back on, just to give us a realistic background. And I'm going to open up our advanced material editor. I want to make this into an ecosystem. I'm going to go to the General tab. I'm going to click Add Plant. I'm going to select our rural maple tree and adjust our scale down just a little. And then populate. We might need to adjust our overall scaling. Maybe a bit more. That should be good. I'm going to increase our density as well. And click populate. And now one of the really neat things we can do is blending our environmental effects. What I want to do now is just drag up our altitude so that we're only populating on the top. Now what we can do is add in a new layer. And I'm going to change that to an ecosystem. I'm going to delete our underlying material. And go back to our General tab for our new object and add a new plant. And we'll just add in our patches of grass. So now what we can do is do the exact opposite of our settings that we had in our Environment tab for our other object. So if we take a look at our trees, we can see that at altitude 0.16 is where we start. Let's go to our grass and let's reduce this so that our ending point is 0.16 and populate. And now what we can do is essentially work back and forth between materials to sort of mix them. And we can create some really, really neat effects this way. So we can have on our lower areas, we just have our grass, and then our higher altitudes are our trees that we have added in there. And we could also adjust the fuzziness, and we could also do this with slope range. So on steep slopes, we could have one material layer and one specific type of ecosystem, and then on the other areas, we could have another type. So in using all of these different features together, we can end up creating some amazing looking scenes in Vue, and actually quite easily.